On? Can you yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm used to being hooked up in this sort of situation, but it's a pleasure being back here in Paris after quite a few years, seeing so many people I know, others I might as well like to know. But I come to do a talk in English parce que je suis poète seulement en anglais. Je peux parler français maintenant un peu heureusement, mais je suis poète pensant et parlant. Seulement, pensant en quel langage, je ne suis pas sûr. I don't know what language thinking goes on in, but it seems somehow to be close to talking. And I talk and I make what I can out of it. I do the best I can. And I came here because I thought this was a good place to think in public. And because friends invited me, of course. But I was thinking of a work by a philosopher I know named Stanley Cavell. Cavell wrote a book, an extremely interesting book, called Must We Mean What We Say? And I thought I would call this piece, Can We Mean What We Say? Which may be the question I would like to ask myself. And the reason I was thinking about this is I was thinking about how I have occasionally represented American interest in consumer goods. You know, I'm very, very poor in relationship to modern consumption. We have a system that plays music, and the amplifier broke down. I spent very little time finding out about amplifiers because they had changed since my childhood. And I went out and bought an amplifier that does too much. It's not so much it makes things louder. It can play 4 speakers, 6 speakers, 8 speakers, play them in Dolby. All I want is an amplifier that plays the music I want to hear the way I want to hear it, and I like it simple. But it had to go through, it had to be attached to the television system because I wanted to occasionally watch tapes that get played through it. So all these connections become sort of baffling, and there are 4 separate control systems that one has to use. And it's hard to remember which one is which. To make it louder, you do this one. To change the image, you do something else. By the time you're through, you have had an exercise in gymnastics because you always forget which remote is the one to use. And you go back and sit down, and you've got the wrong one in your hand, and you go and get another controller. So I'm terrible about this. I'm much better, I used to be much better about repairing older things, in which case I was master of my old cars, for example, were things I dealt with reasonably, I thought. Many years ago, I've never owned a new car. I never bought a new car. Somehow I always had attachment to old cars. The aging machine always seemed to me in need of help. And it was somewhat in a condition like the rest of us. All of us sort of fragile, temporary, semi-steady state systems. And I had a car, had an old Cadillac that I bought many years after its birth, so to speak. The Cadillac was a 1950 Cadillac, and I had it in 1961 or so. And we were living upstate, in a part of upstate New York that gets very cold and snowy, like Paris probably, except it's not near the ocean, it's in the mountains. And it would freeze up. It had a very small battery, 6-volt battery, and in order to make it not go dead, I had to adjust the battery controller, the voltage regulator. In those days, cars had voltage regulators. You open up the car, you open up the voltage regulator, and it's inside is a solenoid, and you take up a couple of coils on the spring, and suddenly you have a 10-volt battery. Now try and do that. Anybody who owns a car will realize that there is no such thing as a voltage regulator. Everything is controlled by computing, and you can't go into the car with a screwdriver. I had an even more eccentric car that I had when I was living in New York. I was living in Greenwich Village, where things could be stolen out from under your seat. And I had a car that was theft-proof, absolutely theft-proof. It was an English four-seater convertible, also very aged, called the Sunbeam Talbot. But the people who had repaired it for the first time had put the transmission, had put the gear shift system in a reverse manner. So that what happened is when you threw the car into first, it went into reverse. And only someone who knew the car would know this. So I figured anybody trying to steal the car would be frightened to death, because suddenly the car would smash into the car and parked in back of him, and he would panic and run away. And the car was never stolen. I mean, of course, so in a certain sense, my relationship to these things was that of like respect for age, or respect for making do. See, the perfection of technology has always seemed to me somewhat dubious, because there is a window of opportunity during which technological advances are brilliant. And it's the time between the time when you finish debugging the machine, and the time between that and when the machine begins to deteriorate, or the software begins to deteriorate. And this window can be very small. Very often, new machines are marketed with bugs in them that have never been debugged, and you have to kind of take your chances. So I knew all the people I knew were a little bit like this. That is, I hadn't yet arrived at a kind of postmodern condition, which made me feel somewhat contemptuous of people who were always looking for the newest and best things. And it wasn't until I got familiar with a second cousin of Eleanor's, that I had to rethink myself in relationship to it. He was a very cheerful young guy who didn't know, who had lived a kind of, what shall I say, a kind of carefree life that he felt was insufficiently ordered. And he felt it was insufficiently ordered, and he, in his odd way for people we knew, he decided he would enter the army, because he thought it would give him a kind of order. It would apply order to him as I thought the way a straitjacket would apply order to somebody. However, he seemed to feel it would provide him with a certain stiffness, a certain rigidity of response that would be necessary to survive in a world that he was not surviving in very well. And he was a kind of charming kid. I refer to him as a kid. He was a charming guy, sort of stocky, stocky little blonde guy, husky and lively. And I guess he was looking forward to the basic training, unlike most people. Because the first time I really spent any time with him, we were living in a little house in Solana Beach, a kind of shabby little beach town. And we were teaching at the university, both Ellie and I were teaching at the University of California. And he said he would come to see us, and we hadn't seen him. He was at this point, I think he was in the military reserves. And he came to park. He brought his car, and he was going to meet us at the university, and he parked in a place where he was going to get a ticket, and I was very worried about him getting a ticket. I said, let's go get the car and get you out of there. So he starts running in the direction of the car, and the two of us are sprinting, sort of tearing through the various parts of the school to get to his car before he gets a ticket from some imaginary meter maid who is always ready to give you a ticket. We're both, chugging away there, and breathlessly we arrive, and happily we discover that the car has not yet been ticketed, and so the first time I saw him it was in motion we were sprinting together. And sprinting together gives you a kind of feeling of good fellowship. But then but what happened was he was spirited away. We were just getting to know him, and he was spirited away on I don't know what he was in. I think he was in something called Special Services, which is a sort of desperately unpleasant operation. And here he was, this good-natured young American who wanted to help people. That is, he had been a medical assistant before. He was great on first aid. And apparently they had made him their medical officer. And so he got called off quickly to the first Bush's war against Saddam Hussein. And he went off with them into this war to defend the marvelous democracy of Kuwait. Now, this took a certain amount of American optimism and naivete. I mean, it's hard to believe that one would be enthusiastic about defending the rights of Kuwait. However, America, in its infinite wisdom, decided to do this, probably because they wanted to defend Saudi Arabia, with whom they had much better relations. And Saudi Arabians wanted us to defend Kuwait. So naturally, since Saudi Arabia has all that oil, we decided to do this. But this was operating in a cloud far above the head of our second cousin. Michael only saw himself as doing the good thing. So what could we do before he was shipped off? We got him a book of phrases in Arabic, figuring that since we knew perfectly well that if any Arabs were captured, he would do the best he could to save their lives. But they'd be frightened to death, feeling that naturally we would try to kill them. So I told him, here's his phrase book. You'll be able to say pleasant things in Arabic if you master it, even though you won't understand what they say to you. Much like some of the French I hear today, because haven't got it in my head yet. You know, you have some of the right phrases, and you don't have enough of them, but the one thing you don't have is the ability to listen and hear what they say, because what they say is unpredictable. However, he survived this war, and he came back and became a kind of oddly brilliant young businessman, which you wouldn't have expected from this rough and ready kid, cheerful as he was. He got into something that is central to the centrality of consumption. He got into designing kitchens. Now, if you're like me, you're not sure what that means. You probably all know about designing kitchens, but I don't, or I didn't until 1991 or two. Because we had an elderly kitchen that was really inefficient and hardly ever worked. And so we went to Michael, who had this business where he designed kitchens. Now, designing kitchens, I thought, was like, you know, you have to put the implements in place and that's it. No, you don't put the implements in place. It's an interior architectural career. You have to decide, do you want a tabletop made of granite? Or do you want a countertop made of marble? Would you like a marble tabletop? Marble will go with what? Stainless steel and maple wood. That would be kind of pretty, wouldn't it? But then it begins to sound like a sculptural enterprise. And the cost of it is the cost of an artwork. Some artworks anyway. So you wind up having a kitchen designed for you. At one point, our elderly kitchen was so bad that we figured we'd ask Michael what to do. And Michael came, and originally he offered us an array of choices that were baffling, absolutely baffling, but startlingly brilliant. You know, you run your hand over a granite top. You know, what do I know how a granite top will absorb grease or not absorb grease? But it feels good. I mean, granite is a nice feeling thing. My childhood was spent to some degree with geology, and I figured that's kind of nice. Granite would be nice, but do I really want this on a tabletop? I mean, do I want it on a countertop? You know, when I'm making scrambled eggs? How does it take scrambled eggs, splattered scrambled eggs? You don't know. You know, but Michael didn't know that either. Michael knew design. He didn't, I mean, like we said, we would go for steel and maple. You know, stainless steel and maple. Well, stainless steel scratches endlessly, but at least it looks good, you know, like, and you can wipe anything off it. It isn't a total catastrophe, unless you drop hydrochloric acid on it or something, which we don't carry around in the kitchen. So, but Michael was even more ambitious than that. And he was designing not only all sorts of interior design for all the, you know, to house in a manner that is appropriate to them, the manner that they deserve, the extraordinary elements that form contemporary living in middle-class America. All these weird devices, you know, the DVD players, the CD players, the videotapes, and you know, eventually you get dragged into this world too, but Michael's world was expanding. He was designing the interiors for every part of the house. And he had this shop, a wonderful shop, and he himself was a kind of colorful guy. Apparently, he had a taste for Vietnamese women. That is to say, he had an aesthetic taste, and he had married one and had a very charming child with her. But she apparently turned out to be very authoritarian. She was an authoritarian Vietnamese, and somehow he was a taste authority, but she was an authority at an economic and social level that he had not anticipated. And apparently they fell out together, and he wound up running off with her cousin. So then he had married her cousin, who was a very sweet, very young Vietnamese girl who had basically done fingernails in a beauty parlor of some sort or another. And so it's hard to tell exactly what kind of communicative life they had together, but they seemed affectionate, so their sex life must have been good, and they had two very beautiful children. And there he was, living a life of a kind of American moving up economically, it seemed, and everything else. And he was interesting. He had things in his life that he had more things in his life than I have ever known, but he used them. See, most Americans I know don't use all the things they have. He had a camper that was like a factory for living, to quote Le Corbusier. You could do everything with it. But he took it to the mountains, and he took his kids and his wife to the mountains, and they all went skiing together with very great, whenever they could steal away. Michael was a great skier, and he taught his 7 or 8 year old child, the oldest one of them, that he had with the first Vietnamese woman, how to ski. The kid was doing the most difficult ski slopes at the age of 9, and he was very proud of his child for doing it. And the kid was a kind of aggressive swimmer. And his life was devoted to the children. What's funny is he had all these great toys. But they weren't toys, because every one of them was used as a kind of connoisseurship. He lived the kind of life of a kind of connoisseurship, of getting the fullest part out of the material life that he could, which was interesting, because it had never occurred to me to want to do that. I mean, I learned to ski when I was 50, and I liked skiing modestly sloped slopes, because I liked the feeling of being on skis. I wasn't terribly interested in the greatest hardships and running the toughest moguls. So you can see I'm sort of lackadaisical about it. But he was sort of like into everything, intensely, all the way. And he was into watching football. We like to watch football games, and I was sorry I just missed the football game. We came just to miss the NFC Championship games. Well, we would have liked to have seen it, but he was like into it, and he got the best television you could conceivably get. It was so large, you were afraid you were going to be hit by one of the linemen. But it was so sharp, the image was so sharp that you could hardly believe it. It was too sharp for life, because when the lineman is that close to you, you don't see him that sharply, unless you have very strange eyes. I could tell you that for sure. That I have experience of. But Michael would research these appalling catalogs. I don't know how many of you look at catalogs for electronic equipment. There's an awful lot of information in there, and much of it is misinformation, and the information you want is often not available. But if you ransack enough catalogs and treat them as if you're doing a serious scientific study, you can eventually come out with what Michael came out with. He came out with the most amazing TV set that I would not have had in my living room all my life, but nevertheless, he had it. And he had two of them. This plasma, one for the bedroom in case you happen to want to watch TV while you're lying in bed and still half asleep, which is probably, I suppose, interesting, but not to me. On the other hand, he savored technical toys the way wine fanciers savor the great wines. He could tell the difference between one television set and another television set, the way you can tell which chateau has better wines, and whether this particular vintage year was better than the other vintage year, and whether the grapes grew on the right side of the hill or the left side of the hill. And Michael knew that about television sets, like which television set was better in a sunny room and which was better in a shady room. Because after all, you have to realize that the glare from the sun will in fact distort what's on the television set too. And you don't want to lose the contour of the lineman, the great lineman charging you at the most appropriate moment. You want to watch the quarterback getting killed with great precision. Or you want to see the war, people in the war being slaughtered by roadside bombs or whatever. So you see these things with great, and everything he did, he had a little Jeep and a camper and a boat. And we went out on his boat with him, and his little 9-year-old was steering around the little motorboat with great skill. And you could see that his life was a life of incredibly significant pleasures in the system of America's consumption that I had underrated the precision of and the richness of. And yet, somehow, to me, it always felt alien. And yet, I mean, and I have, we live a comfortable enough life ourselves. I mean, it's not like we don't live a comfortable life. But somehow my feelings are often with people who are like this couple that we knew, Jim and Jeanette, and her name was Jennifer, I think. And this guy was a kind of survivalist. A survivalist who was always preparing. He always figured the country was out to get him. The United States was out to get him no matter what he was doing. If it wasn't taxes, they were out to get him. They were out to make laws that would infringe his right to pee in public or whatever. I mean, I don't know what it was he was objecting to, but he would talk your head off about what was wrong with the American government. And on that, I would tend to agree with him often enough. But he was an ex-veteran of some war or another, probably the Korean War. And he was a very tiny little guy who talked a fierce line, but actually was one of the sweetest people we knew. And he and his wife, who actually was a competent nurse, lived a kind of nomadic life in a camper that was always breaking down as he was on his way from one job to another, putting together, these are people without medical care, these are people without insurance, these are people with no future, only a present, and they're surviving. So his survivalism was not so much an armed resistance to the government as it was an attempt to live outside the system. And they had this aged camper that was always breaking down, and he would be going to take temporary jobs, either in Miami, Florida, or in Escondido in Southern California, and he'd work for a while in construction, or he'd be called together by friends. He would be called by friends to work together with him. And his wife, who was more educated and apparently was really very fond of him, hung in there with him in spite of their differences. Probably she felt there was no differences, and they were always in trouble. But they were also very generous and amiable people. When my son Blaise had to move his house he had to move his stuff from his place in Washington, D.C. To a place in California where he had a new job and where his wife was going to practice medicine. He had a car that had to be driven across the country, and he had the rest of his stuff that had to be taken in a truck. So who was going to take the truck? Jim and Jennifer took the truck across the country, and we entrusted it to them, and they delivered it in perfect shape. I mean, because they were very reliable people, although the look of them you would think was not reliable. You would say they're not reliable, and they're scruffy looking. But what are they? They're survivors who live beneath the level of American middle-class consumption. They're not so much consumers as barely scraping it together to make it with a camper that would hardly hold together. But this didn't make him bitter. It didn't make either of them bitter. On the other hand, there are those for whom this forms a kind of core of deep, dark bitterness. And in the course of living, this bitterness seeds into something more problematic. It wasn't the case with these people. My sister-in-law was dying in Southern California of cancer, and we needed people to take care of her, and who took care of her? But this couple took care of her for a long period of time. And they attended her with the greatest tenderness. As I say, these are the people who live below the surface. America is not all affluence and wealth. And some of this lack of affluence and wealth is desperate. Some of it is so desperate that it forms like bile in the system. And what happened, oddly enough, was somebody of this kind at one point collided with the people in the middle. My cousin, our second cousin, got the bad news that his wife had cancer. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember what kind of cancer it was. It was a very rare form of cancer, and I think it was an adrenal cancer or something of that sort. And the cancer was treatable. It was very treatable, apparently, with radiation, by severe treatment of radiation. Maybe it wasn't adrenal cancer, maybe it was ovarian, or cervical cancer, I'm sorry, cervical cancer. Sometimes you don't remember which one it is, the one or the other. It was cervical cancer, and it was treatable. But it was a very horrifying, rigorous treatment that took place over a month after the surgery. And Michael was always at hand. His business was going on. He'd carry on his business by working late into the night, designing kitchens. But during the day, he would be with his wife in the hospital when she was there. He would take her to the hospital. He would take the two children he had with her to school. He parked the camper in the parking lot of the hospital. And he was managing all the time, somehow desperately, to keep it all together with the same incredible good cheer with which he and I sprinted across the campus of UCSD to make sure that he didn't get a ticket. And by the end of the month, Twee, which was his wife's name, was seen as being clear of the cancer, and they went to celebrate. They went to a place called Extraordinary Desserts. I always think of it as extravagant desserts. It's the kind of desserts that I can only think about but have never really eaten. You know, they're filled with whipped cream. They're great. I mean, they're incredibly great desserts, but they're too great for me. And he went there with another couple. They were celebrating together Twee's recovery. And they were sitting in this it's like a small cafe, which is not, it has a few tables, and that has places where you buy the desserts and to take them out. They were sitting there and they were having a great time talking, these two attractive, intelligent couples. And a scruffy-looking guy walked in from the street, kind of jeans and a beaten-up jacket, T-shirt. He was sort of standing. They noticed he was standing about 5 feet away from the table, staring at Michael. And Michael, who, undisturbed but realizing something was wrong, said, "Can I help you?" Turned to the guy said something to him, but what he said was incoherent and incomprehensible. Michael realized that this was something of a problem, called over the waiter and said, "I think you should call the police." And the waiter sent their bouncer over, and the bouncer came and escorted the guy out the door. 10 minutes later, the man came back in with a gun. Michael didn't see him. He shot Michael in the head, blew the back of his head off, and shot the other man who had ducked suddenly to try to protect his wife. And the bullet lodged in his shoulder, grazed his head and lodged in his shoulder, and Michael was dead. Twee was shaken beyond belief, and Michael was completely gone. There wasn't a chance of doing anything. Now, the two worlds came together in this strange way. Nothing is explained by the way the two worlds came together. But the two worlds came together, and Michael's fortunate life becomes now a desperate life in which the misfortune of the family and the desperation of the family hangs over everything like a cloud. Was Michael's business rich enough to provide her to provide her and the family with enough insurance? Well, probably not, because Michael was a businessman on the way up. A businessman on the way up mortgages his present in order to gain his future. So you see the problem coming up. How can she support the two children as a manicurist? Or will she have to go to college and become a software designer? What will recover? The children that he spent so much time with, what will they do? Who will take care of them? Michael's father is in Chicago. His father is an investment counselor, but he lives in Chicago, and he and his wife are unlikely to be able to come to Southern California for more than a short period of time. But Michael was part of a community, a curious community. The people who lived in his neighborhood all rallied, rather astonishingly, to help. And they were part of a neighborhood I'd never seen anything like. The community level of these people was such that they gathered around, they came, they took answers, they were at the house all the time for a whole week. They were sitting around there, they took care of the kids, they delivered them to school, they started a fund. But the lives in this way that change this way, the randomness of the world that confronts you, does it have a meaning? And can I even express, I started this talk with the intention of asking whether I can say what I mean, whether I can mean what I say. And I don't know whether I can mean what I say, because what I say is not necessarily what I mean. My account of Michael's life seems to me to be still borne down by the resoluteness with which we look upon the consumption world. His connoisseurship is such that I don't think even I've evoked it adequately. And the kind of notion of enjoying pleasure, that the Epicurean nature of his treatment of this sort of consumption has a certain positiveness. The extraction of life from this dismal world of consumer goods seemed to me a triumph of Michael's, an artistic triumph of a sort that I had never imagined. And trying to give you the impression of it, it makes me feel that I'm not adequate to expressing the Epicurean brilliance with which he lived and the disaster into which his life had fallen with this end of it. And I'm not sure even that my sense of the outlaw or the sub-law or sub-world is adequate to dealing with it. Because we all have preconceptions. Language is always bordered by the preconceptions we have before we started talking or before we started writing. Nothing comes from the beginning. And everything we say starts late in the game. There's something late in the game. I mean, like that he was a soldier, that he was in special forces, seems to suggest he was not the benevolent guy who we knew, who was driving home one day, saw somebody in an accident at the roadway lying seemingly unconscious, parked his car and immediately rushed out and gave the guy CPR. And the guy had no pulse, but Michael gave him, eventually gave him a tracheotomy. And you know, this is not something a doctor would do because they could get sued for malpractice. And in America, malpractice suits are very common. So doctors don't stop by the roadside for wounded people. But Michael wasn't a doctor, so he could stop. He was a medical corpsman, so he could stop because he didn't care about malpractice. No, Michael was something other than what I know, which suggests to me that many things are other than what we know. We know he was a soldier, but what did he think soldiering was? Well, I think he thought soldiering was doing the right thing. I don't think it was doing the right thing, but I think he thought he was doing the right thing. So how do I hold up the situation? He was a young soldier. If I say he was a young soldier, you think of America as a stupid investment in Iraq. But he didn't call the war, and it was the earlier war anyway, and it didn't have quite the same clarity that this one has of the disaster it is. It was supported by other people, and the kind of problem essentially is that people operate beneath the level of the conceptions that in fact sometimes determine their lives. But he wasn't killed in war. He was killed in a grotesque and meaningless act of violence by somebody who's still at large in the United States, though they know who he was, because there was technology in the restaurant. There was a surveillance camera, and they had his picture on the surveillance camera. And they put out an APB. They knew his name. They knew his medical problems. They had all the bureaucratic information, but they haven't found the killer. They knew he had bad trouble, that he lived on Prozac, but that he hadn't taken his Prozac was probable. So the absence of Prozac may have caused Michael's death. Or was it the discrepancy between the two levels of society? that can come to haunt you. Whether it's, and the people who are, the one getting killed is innocent, and the killer is independent of rationality, but has probably some real grievance among other things. But what do you make of the real grievance? The real grievance directed against no one related to the grievance. No one related to the grievance except by the kind of generalization that's like the defect in my understanding itself. What we understand is always beset by things we think we understand and don't understand. Understanding itself is difficult. And my work itself is aimed largely to deal with the intractable difficulties of my own misunderstanding. And that's why I say I'm not sure that I can say what I mean, or I can mean what I say. I can try to. It's funny in French. In French, it's like saying, the saying and the meaning that go together, you know, ça veut dire, vouloir dire. You want to say something, you mean something, but do you say it? Vouloir dire is not dire, but dire and vouloir dire stand in a funny relationship to each other. And vouloir penser, I don't know. You want to think about it. I want to think about it. And my work is directed to this kind of aim, always with some strong sense of my own insufficiency and all our insufficiency before the difficult, the obdurate and contingent character of our lives. Thank you. You're a generous audience and patient.